Well, firstly, good morning, everybody, and welcome to techUK's webinar entitled Is Diverse Recruitment Just a Numbers Game? As part of techUK. First of all, a brief introduction from me as moderator. So my name's James Corcoran. I work for an organisation called Sanderson Government Defence, and I'm also a current council member of techUK Skills and Diversity Council. We're in a fortunate position to have a holistic, behind the scenes view of employer and employee landscape in the UK, clearly specialising in government and defence markets. We see a day-to-day focus, and we see day-to-day opportunity and of course challenges associated with diverse recruitment, and the complexity, I suppose, most importantly, of the perceived solution. Bringing together today a group of highly experienced and expert individuals. The aim of the webinar today is to declutter some of the information out there and to close off some of the myths and explore best practice within this industry. The webinar today will flow through current candidate market perception, through attraction, into onboarding, mitigating turnover, and then concluding with case studies of where expert diverse recruitment strategies have actually made a difference. We are tied to an hour, and therefore, firstly, if I can ask everybody to be on mute throughout. We will field questions at the end of the webinar, clearly time permitting. And if you have any questions post-webinar, please do reach out to techUK or myself, and we'll do our best to respond or post a question during the webinar, obviously using the chat function that Nimi's already opened up. Clearly, it's a topic we could spend a lot of time discussing. So with no further ado, if we start with the candidate marketplace, so perception of the marketplace, Stephanie Itimi, CEO of Seidea, which is the BAME Women in Cyber organisation, looking at grassroots and what do job seekers and those looking to enter the industry actually have to say. I've got a couple of questions to pose to you to start off with, if I may. And I know you've done some research very recently on this topic. What are the key challenges your members are finding when they're trying to enter the technology industry, would you say?
Hi James, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. Hopefully everyone can hear me. What I found out from my members is that the first thing is people don't really understand what the cybersecurity industry is about. They don't really understand what type of jobs exist within the industry. So a lot of people tend to think cybersecurity, they think ethical hackers, but we know that cybersecurity is more broader than that. And I think from my last research, one thing that really came out was how expensive the UK qualifications were. So if you want to enter the cybersecurity, you need a CISMP, which is the UK one. And that tends to be 1,000 to 3,000 when you're trying to get certifications from a UK body. Unfortunately, because a lot of them can't afford that, they tend to go for the American ones, which tend to be CompTIA Security Plus, because it's a cheaper option and they can kind of learn the course from Udemy. The second thing that was highlighted has to be job descriptions. A lot of the job descriptions tend to be copy and paste. So it says that, you know, you need a CISSP, which you need, I think, about 5 years of experience before you even get that certification. But if you don't have that and you're suggesting that for an entry-level role, it doesn't make sense. So a lot of them are not actually able to even break into the industry because of these barriers that persist. And also, when we're actually looking at the diversity and representation, that's something that's quite important. You know, you can't really be what you can't see. And if you're not seeing a lot of people who look like yourself within the industry, you're unlikely to apply for that role. And even from like the DCMS, they released a recent report about cybersecurity skills, and it showed that 15% of the UK sector are women and 16% are people from minority groups. So it's a very white male dominated industry and tends to have a lot of ex-military veterans just because of like the similarities between their backgrounds and cybersecurity. So these tend to be the issues, the lack of clear job descriptions, not really knowing if you're asking for an entry level role, there's certain certifications you shouldn't be asking for. And if the certifications are expensive, how are you able to get into the industry? And if you don't know what jobs are available, how are you then able to apply for it? And going back to the DCMS report, it also showed that 35% of the jobs were word of mouth. So the jobs are like, 65% of the jobs are what you even see, while 35% are jobs you don't see. So these are the barriers that exist from a candidate perspective of when trying to enter an industry, which doesn't really seem clear to you, but also when you try to actually get in, there's a lack of experience, even if you can afford the certifications. So that's, I guess, from my point of view, would be the issues with my members.
When we did a talk together just before Christmas last year, it seems a very long time ago now. I remember two things that really struck me from that talk. The first thing was from research. It suggested that there was going to be over 200,000 open cyber roles in the UK by the end of 2022, which is an extraordinary number, and certainly something that won't be combated just by doing what's always been done, ultimately. And I think the second thing that really struck was ultimately the fact that some of the questions that were being posed at the end of that seminar were what we may feel to be very simple questions, but we only feel that way because we know the answers, and the answers are accessible to us given the roles that we do. So I wholeheartedly agree, and the job description aspect as well, that's something that really does need to change, and I hope will change, and it's something that part of the Skills and Diversity Council have been discussing recently. You can't just go by job descriptions nowadays, you have to go by people's strengths and work roles around them. So second part of this then is with the feedback from your members and some of the aspects that you just covered, do you feel, it's I suppose quite a loaded question, but do you feel there are any obvious solutions to some of the challenges that have been posed, and challenges that you've seen and heard?
Yeah, I feel like, especially within cybersecurity, we need more visibility. I think there's a lot of women in coding, and when people think women in tech, they think software engineers, but they don't really think about cybersecurity. And again, going back to my point, you can't be what you can't see. So I definitely think there needs to be more people talking about the experiences, especially women in cybersecurity. This is how I got into the industry. This is what I was able to overcome, because by learning those stories, like you said, with job descriptions, you can't really get a feel from a job. But if somebody within who maybe previously worked in that role is able to say, this is what I do for my day to day, and gives that personal touch, then you're able to understand, okay, if I'm a transitioner, because a lot of my members tend to be people transitioning from other industries into cybersecurity, you can think, actually, I've done a bit of risk management, I've done this in my role, and then I'm able to actually apply within that role. And I think with the job description also, that's something that's very, very simple. Instead of copying and pasting, actually thinking, if it's an entry level role, what type of certifications? You might need the beginner ones that I talk about, CISMP, Security Plus. But also, I believe that if we were able to have more apprenticeships, more internship opportunities as well, it would give those who are unlikely to be in the industry, or those who are underrepresented, a chance to actually get their foot in the door, because they're able to actually gain experience. Because we have this kind of vicious cycle where you don't have the qualifications, you get the qualifications, you don't have the experience. And it's like, if you don't give me experience, how am I actually able to get experience? So I definitely think there needs to be more like insight days, internship opportunities, apprenticeships, which gives an easier pipeline, especially for civilians and women, especially, an entry into the industry. And I don't think that that's being done enough. So that would probably be my solutions.
And when we were discussing this 1 or 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the timeframes associated with internships, ultimately, and apprenticeships. I mean, internships can seem such a formal word in terms of its transaction, but internship could be a week, it could be a month, it could be a year. And I think we're discussing it, actually, the flexibility on what an internship looks like to provide that level of or entry capability is really important. Thank you, Steph. So if I can, so we're talking about that's the feedback from the marketplace and looking at some of the potential solutions to how we can go about challenging some of those aspects. If I can move on to Janine, Janine Chamberlain, Director of Enterprise Sales at LinkedIn Talent Solutions. I've got a bit of a long question for you, actually, and it's based around, we're going to talk about attraction, so attracting diverse talent, what works and what differentiates. So, Janine, if I may, with LinkedIn being a leading organisation for the attraction of potential staff, you'll probably have seen a cross-section of techniques and, of course, advised your clients on effective avenues. When you've worked with these clients, what have you learned or seen when it comes to the delivery of an effective, inclusive attraction strategy?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I'm probably going to repeat a little bit of what Steph said. And I think that's quite a good thing, because it sounds like whatever you are hearing as barriers, this is also coming back to people who are in hiring manager or recruitment positions, and they are already starting to make adjustments that actually align exactly to what you said. But I think there's a couple of things to really think about. First of all, I think as an organization, you need to understand what's the talent pool that you are going after, and understand where do you reach the people that you're trying to bring into your organization. So, you know, similarly to kind of expanding to include interns, grads, and things like that, it's also about expanding beyond where you typically post your jobs. Are you actually reaching the right people that way? So I think that's really important. And if you know your talent pool, do you also understand what they care about, so that you can start to talk more about what they care about in your job descriptions, for example, or in your sort of explanation of what it's like to work at your company? Which is kind of a nice segue to actually, how do you position yourself as an employer of choice for the people that you're trying to attract? And I think making it very clear in your communications that you have a diversity and inclusion strategy, I think that's really important. We've actually seen that the perception of companies changes just by having someone in the company who is in charge of diversity and inclusion. Just by having that person in the company, you're perceived as a more inclusive organization already. So making sure that you talk about that, and actually kind of aligned to what Steph just mentioned as well, get your employees to talk about their experiences. And especially if you have women or a Black woman or a Black man, someone who you are trying to attract as well, the role models that we all need to see. Oh yes, I can be successful in that organization because I've just seen someone else who looks like me, who feels like me, who talks like me. So I think it's really important that you share that as an organization. And then I would think about the language that you use. So Steph already talked about job specs. And just to like maybe reiterate, I totally agree. And I think there's two aspects to it. One is, what's the language that you are using? So for example, are you using words like demanding? That's really off-putting for a large proportion of our population, namely all women. So you're already cutting out all the women by saying that a job is demanding, or that you need to work demanding hours or something like that. So really think about the language that's used. And then the second point is around those expectations. And I am only repeating it because I saw a great example of a job spec the other day that actually said, we are not concerned with your formal qualifications. We just need you to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And I thought that was just such a nice way of lowering, you know, not lowering the bar, but you're lowering the barrier. You're allowing people to go, oh, I can probably do that, even though I don't have a master's degree, which most of the other specs will ask for. And the final thing I will say is, because all of this takes a bit of time, start early. You can't leave it to the last moment when it's crunch time and you really need to bring these people in. If you're serious about your diversity strategy, you need to start 6 to 12 months in advance and make sure that you have your campaigns running, that you're reaching out and you're building the pipeline of candidates that you ultimately want to hire, because it is going to take a little bit longer, and we just need to, you know, invest the time because it's so important for us.
Thanks, Janine. Interestingly, a couple of aspects that you pulled out there. First of all, the D&I strategy. That's something that appealed to me in terms of writing or putting together this webinar, because you know, you do see a lot in the marketplace where D&I strategies and will be put into play, but they'll be focused on specific targets and specific numbers, yet with no process to reach those targets or reach those numbers. And it's almost a case of, you know, we've put these targets in place, so we've ticked a box, and not so much about we've put these targets in play, right, how do we go about actually achieving them and delivering them? So I think it's a really key point. And going back to Steph as well, the language, as you've picked up on, within cyber is prevalent, you know, threat, attack, defense, and those aspects within cyber are off-putting, you know, against a certain section of society, of course. So then moving forward, then going through the attraction stage, that's what will help differentiate. Looking at the recruitment process now, which is the second part of this, I suppose, because clearly attraction is only a proportion of the process for an employer and a future employee to undertake. From conversations you've had with your clients, what practices have you seen that really stand out when bringing a candidate from attraction to offer and acceptance, would you say?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things. And actually, to come back to your point around targets, I think it's such an interesting conversation, right? I don't necessarily believe that targets drive the right behavior because there's so much resistance against them and all of that. However, there's numerous examples that show that when you do have maybe what you would call soft targets, it actually makes a huge difference. So there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight. One is the Rooney Rule, and I appreciate that this is an American story, but in case you don't know it, so in the NFL in the US back in 2002, they created this new process that forced every NFL team to include at least one Black or brown person in the interview process when they were hiring for managers, because there was a significant lack of managers in the NFL, Black managers, sorry, in the NFL. And there was no quota around you have to hire or you have to interview a number of people. It was just you have to include at least one person. And just by doing that, they've managed to increase the number of Black managers significantly, because the consensus at least was that all of a sudden they saw people in the process that they would have otherwise not considered. So is it a numbers game? To some extent, yes. You need to see those people in your interview process to actually hire them, right? But the target could be simply on your slate of candidates. There's also a really lovely video on the Harvard Business Review website that talks about a bit of research. That research shows very clearly that if you run an interview process, and let's say that you have 3 white men and 1 Black person in the process, the odds that the Black person gets hired are pretty much 0%. Why? Because in that you are actually highlighting the otherness, the difference, the sort of uniqueness of that one person. As soon as you change it to a 50-50 slate, the chances of the other person getting hired increases by nearly 200 times. So actually, it is a numbers game. You need to bring those people through the door. So that would be my first point. Make sure that you always have a balanced slate of candidates, bringing them through the process. Then when you think about that process as they are sort of in the initial door, right? If they're going through the interview process itself, I think it's really important that it's consistent for every candidate that you see. So make sure you know exactly what you're going to ask of each of these candidates, and don't tailor it to the different people. I think you need to have a really fair and balanced process. But also, who is actually running that interview process from your organization's point of view? again, going back to the idea of role models, is there someone in that process who looks like me, who feels like me, who talks like me, someone that I can relate to and makes me think, yes, I am going to be able to be successful in that organization. So making sure you also have a diverse panel interviewing the candidates, I think, is really important. Obviously, the secondary sort of benefit of that is that you have different people who have different opinions, and they will interpret the answers of the candidate differently. And then the final thing that comes to my mind, but I know that this isn't possible for every single role, but I think certainly when you run internship recruitment or graduate recruitment, where possible, try and run blind auditions. I think this is a pretty well-known kind of thing, but again, started in the US many, many years ago in orchestras, where they found that there were very few women on the orchestras, and what they started doing is actually getting the musicians to audition behind a closed curtain so that no one could see who was behind that curtain. And with that, they've increased the number of women on orchestras by about 30% in a pretty short space of time. So blind auditions, whilst you might not actually have people sitting behind a curtain, could simply be having people do an assessment online. And before you actually know what school did they go to, what gender do they have, where are they from, what language do they speak, what color are they, you will already start to see, like, here are the people who stand out purely based on how they complete an assessment, not at all based on any of the other factors that you so obviously eagerly want to not include in that decision making. So that would be the other thing that I would include, and that I've seen my customers do really effectively.
Thank you, Ginny. So I think really from what I take from that, it's micro, not macro. There could be a macro number, but you're looking person by person. It's about the people, not the macro number. Brilliant, thank you. So we'll move on now to Elizabeth Oniola, Development Director, Inclusive Boards. So we're going to cover, or Elizabeth's going to cover, onboarding diverse talent and mitigating turnover. Hi, Elizabeth. So onboarding, especially in today's new working environment, is a complex process. It's essential that we don't overlook individuals, and this goes back to Janine's point, overlook individuals' needs throughout the process. What would you describe as an effective inclusive onboarding strategy?
Sure. I would say it probably follows on from all of the things that's been said. I think the idea that once you've done your diversity and inclusive recruitment process quite well, the onboarding becomes equally as important. So once you've got the diverse candidates in, there's a real need to make sure that the onboarding has taken them into account. From the Society of Human Resources, it shows that there's 50% more productivity when a new hire or staff members have had really good onboarding, and 54% higher engagement. And in the same study, it also shows that 69% are likely to stay at an organization for 3 years if they've had a positive onboarding experience. So that just goes to show and emphasize the importance of having, once you've gotten someone in, it's really important to make sure that they have a positive experience from the outset. And especially if you've put an equal opportunity statement in your candidate pack, your onboarding process is the ideal time to show your real commitment to put it into practice. And it starts from asking yourself key questions. It starts from auditing your current process. So what are you currently doing well? And what areas of improvements do you have? And secondly, I think it's also important to remember that each new hire, each new staff member, they're different. Everyone is different. So there's a need to ask each person, what do you need from us in order to do your job properly? By asking everyone that question, you'd be surprised at the different answers or suggestions that you will get, which means they're having a good experience from you. And I would say it's important to break down your onboarding into 3 different categories. There's the operational side, there's the social, and then there's the strategic. So going into the operational side of things, it's thinking about having the tour of the office even before they've started. I know in this COVID-19 period, it's quite difficult to do that. but even for any new hires you've had over this period, just that gesture in itself makes a big difference. Allowing meet and greet with key staff members, not just their managers, but different people in the organization. There was a study from McKinsey, I believe, where it talks about the onlys, when they talk about if you're the only woman on a ship team, but also what needs to be taken into account is that sometimes it's even more difficult if you're the only Black woman in a team. And from organizations, tech organizations that I've spoken to, there's frustrations when that's not even acknowledged. So your onboarding process should acknowledge those differences and think about ways in which you can support them from the outset. Also making sure that everything they need is ready and set up to go. They're not missing out on anything that others may have had. And also reviewing your policies, it's important. Organizations, policies are meant to be reviewed annually anyway. And there's a need to think about making sure that your policies include, have inclusive languages. Thinking about parental leave policy, for example, have you made sure that you've thought about same-sex couples or single parents in your parental leave policy? And this is what you should be doing for all your other policies. What are you missing out on? Anybody? Are there specific groups that you're missing out on? If you're using HR tech, have you thought about disabled candidates, those who are visually impaired, making sure that you have captioning in your videos, making sure that your images have alt text, so anyone who uses a screen reading software, when your onboarding is an opportunity to acknowledge the differences of your staff, your new hires. And when it comes to the social side of things, it's involving the incumbent staff members, whether you're a large organization or a small organization. It's encouraging the incumbent staff members to meet the new people in their team, meet the new people in their department. It's where you can show your culture, be explicit about the culture. Your culture is, this is how we do things in our organization. So it becomes important to involve the current staff members in the onboarding process. More often than not, onboarding involves only the HR team and maybe the manager, but there's a need to also involve any current staff members that you have in the process. And finally, the strategic is thinking about your vision and your mission. Sure, they've already been hired, they know why they want to join the organization, but remember, they're still trying to get to know you, and equally you're still trying to get to know them. So that's an opportunity to show them why you exist, what the goals and the objectives of your organizations are, get them to really buy into it. So to conclude is to say that you're not going to cover all your bases at once. You're not going to completely cater for every single staff member during your onboarding process, but it's been open to the feedback that you're going to receive. It's been open to the fact that people are different, and rather than saying, and rather than not seeing the difference, it's acknowledging the difference and personalizing the onboarding process where possible.
I think that's fantastic. The acknowledging the difference. I think, you know, people can be shy or fearful of acknowledging difference, but actually it's really crucial as part of the process. We are, before I ask the next question, just to prompt any questions, we are running pretty much on schedule, which should give us sort of 10 minutes at the end to have some questions and answers. So please do feel you can ask a question in the chat, and it'll be picked up. Elizabeth, back to you, and looking at onboarding again. So ineffective and blanket onboarding, workforce integration can lead to a high turnover that the data suggests. What have you seen as best practice in this market in regards to workforce integration and onboarding, and what advice would you have around mitigating the risk of a high turnover?
So when it comes to mitigating, best practices when it comes to mitigating high staff turnover, it goes back to what can you do to support the person that's just started, or regardless of how long they've been there. Okay, they've passed probation, so that means definitely you want to keep them. So it's thinking about, can you consider mentoring schemes much earlier in the process? So is there a way that you can pair them up with someone who looks like them? It goes back to, do you have someone who looks like them in the organization? And if you don't, do you have someone who understands the work that they're doing and supporting them? So it's almost creating a buddy scheme. If you don't want to formalize and call it a mentoring scheme, it's also a buddy scheme in itself. And one of the key things that that increases staff turnover is progression. So especially when it comes to candidates from a diverse background, when you think of candidates from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, they're more likely to leave an organization if they don't see how they can progress. So there's a real sense to there's a real need, to map out your progression, to map out the progression routes within an organization. From personal experience, I know that I've left an organization when I haven't seen a path that means a path that I would enjoy or thrive within the organization. So it's about mapping out the different ways in which a staff member within a specific team or different skill set can progress within the organization. And that could be something, it could be a sideways move, it could be an upwards move. It's about mapping out what that could look like and supporting that with maybe shadowing, looking at their personal development plans and asking them to shadow those people that they eventually wanted with the position they want to progress into. So you can formalize these processes right from your onboarding and show them, in this organization, this is how you can progress. Excuse me, and these are the different ways in which you can do that. And also showing them what the culture of the organization is. Whenever I've conducted some consultancy advisory piece of work when it comes to diversity and inclusion, one of the key issues that's come up is the fact that in most organizations, the staff members don't know what diversity and inclusion means to that particular organization itself. So you need to identify within your organization what diversity and inclusion means to you. Again, it goes back to, it doesn't, whilst it means something, it's quite general, it may mean something different to you. There may be different equality strands that you want to focus on in your organization. And it's really important for all staff members to know what that looks like. And in addition to that, another key issue that we find that increases turnover is this idea of microaggression. Microaggression, it's so small, you can't notice it more often than not. However, the person that experiences it feels it every single day. And from early on in the process, you can show any new staff members, and in general, all your staff members, this is how we can challenge each other openly and discreetly. Whenever you've spotted or seen something that offends you or could offend someone else, this is how we challenge behaviors within our organization. And most organizations are not clear on what that looks like. So that means if I experience any form of microaggression, I wouldn't know how to deal with it. So that's also important to identify and get feedback from staff members as well, not just through your employee survey, but after the onboarding process, before they start, get feedback from them. And I would say, finally, give people the space to settle in. There's a need to get people to start and hit the ground running. Give people space to settle in. Let them acclimatize to your own language within your organization, how you speak, how you do things. So I would say those are solutions that can be thought about when it comes to mitigating staff turnover, including some of the best practices I've mentioned.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you. And there's a theme that seems to be running through that it's all about the micro, all about the person, making this entire flow around the person and personal. And also one thing I think that struck me before as a theme was transferring the question, can I, to the statement, I can. So going to your point in terms of mapping out the progression available to somebody, looking at the I can, this is what the goal looks like, this is what I can achieve, rather than can I achieve it by having to ask the question. Thank you, Elizabeth. So moving on to Simon Langley, Head of Diversity Inclusion at the Royal London Group. Hi, Simon. So we're going to look at challenges identified and the solutions implemented, and then of course maintained afterwards, because it's an ongoing process. Simon, in your experience, where have you identified specific challenges, and do you find there to be a common theme?
Yes, sadly, I think there is. So I think there's a really disappointing lack of awareness still in the UK around just what the tech sector does. And there's a consequence of that is that, I mean, you end up in a situation where we've got, what, 44% of the workforce is female, and yet only 17% of the workforce in the tech sector is female. If you look at girls and women who are studying A-level computer science or advanced higher computer science, I think it's around 7%. And yet it's estimated only half of them will then end up in the tech sector. If you look across into the BAME community, the recent survey that was done by the British Computer Society seems to suggest that everything's sort of okay, but actually when you dig into the numbers, because they use this aggregate of, they looked at BAME as a single group, the reality is that people from an Asian background are far more likely to be working in the tech sector than somebody from a black background. So there are still disparities that are going on within the sector. A lot of this happens very, very early on. So for me, I think one of the biggest disappointments was the falling away of things like the education business partnerships with schools, and the pathetic nature of careers advice in schools at the moment. Kids have to be making their decisions really quite early as to what it is they want to do. And if you want to get into the tech sector, you need to be thinking about science and maths at A-level. If you're going to go through the sort of graduate route, you certainly need to be looking for good qualifications at GCSE or the equivalent in Scotland if you are looking to go through the apprenticeship route. And that means getting that conversation going early. So I think those things really are quite challenging. I think the other thing that's happening a lot in industry still at the moment is this continuous looking to get external hires. So there's a real obstacle for people who are in your workforce, who are looking at that I can, and yet the company is telling them, actually, no, you can't, because we need somebody quickly. And rather than investing in developing you, we're just going to go out and get an external hire. And what that demonstrates is a woeful lack of strategic workforce planning. It just strikes me that as a company, you need to know what it is you're going to need 5 to 10 years out. You certainly need to be putting the time into planning that, and then looking at your existing workforce and developing them to meet your needs in the future, rather than simply going out and hiring. And it's that sort of getting the balance right between buy and build, I think, is absolutely key.
Thanks, Simon. And actually, that your last point there, I think, then goes back to Steph's original point in terms of job specs. You know, if you're going to formulate a job spec for a job role, you're going to have to look for a person. Whereas if you look at the skills and potential of the people that you currently have in your resource pool internally, then look for strengths and build upon those strengths and promote internally, which then, you know, takes on Elizabeth's point in terms of the progression opportunities for somebody as well. And interesting, you know, you mentioned the internships and apprenticeships again. That's already been raised, so it's a relevant issue, and grads and pre-workforce issues rather than even current workforce issues. So investment ultimately in the future. So the second question, I suppose it's a relatively tough question for you, but how have you addressed these challenges?
Well, there's a number of different ways. So I think for me, a big thing is breaking down stereotypes. So I've done a lot of work here in current organisation, but also in previous organisations, working to try and get the message across that tech and engineering, it isn't dirty work, it isn't geeky work. And there have been some things that have really paid off. I think a big thing is getting into schools early, and getting, companies need to fill that gap that has been left by the lack of careers advice and step in. I think schools very often welcome the support from companies. And so getting involved in programs like Your Future, Your Ambition, which is a brilliant program in London that gets kids in from all across the city to come in and meet tech companies and tech related companies and they run sort of different programs during the course of the day. So there's one for primary, there's one for early secondary, and there's one for sixth form. And those sorts of things really do engage and open kids' eyes to the possibilities that are out there. I think spending some time working with professional bodies. So whether it's, I've done work in the past with the Royal Academy of Engineering, who've really focused a lot on how they increase diversity within the broad engineering sector, but also looking at the specialist bodies, so the Institute of Actuaries from the financial world or BCS within the tech world, to try and help to drive programs that increase diversity generally and don't come at it from a purely parochial point of view. In other words, what's going to be right for my company? This is a sector-wide challenge, and therefore all of us as businesses, I think, need to work together on this, because in the end, it's going to be for the benefit of all of us. With this potential shortfall of hundreds of thousands of jobs in the sector not being filled, puts Britain PLC at risk, and we do need to address that. I think there are things, we talked about onboarding earlier, and I think that whole message around onboarding, one of the most important things within that is explaining to potential new employees, and then when they come in, your actual new employees, all the other things that happen in your organisation. So, we've built up employee networks over the years, which we're very proud of. Those employee networks provide a whole series of different supports to employees from diverse backgrounds. Part of that, I think, has to be thinking about what sort of career development opportunities you want. Don't be afraid to put together specialist development programs that meet the needs of diverse employees. One-size-fits-all solutions don't work. You have to tailor what you're doing to the audience that you want. I think going out and using good job boards, it's okay using the sort of really big players, but I think also to the point that Janine was making earlier, and Steph, that actually you need to reach out and go to some specialist areas as well. If you've got particular roles you want to fill, or there are particular types of people you want to attract, then there are some really good job boards out there. We've been quite successful using things like Return Hub to bring in people who are coming back in as a second career into the workforce at quite senior levels. But also, I think just reaching out to, so for example, Even Break in the disability space can access really, really good candidates. I think also think about your routes in. So one of the things we're working on in Royal London at the moment within our women's network, we have a Women in Technology group, and they do a lot of work around myth busting and also reaching out to schools. So they work with a couple of schools in Edinburgh and a couple of schools in London, helping to sort of break down some of the myths about women in technology. We're also looking at different routes in for apprenticeships and partnering with organisations who specialise in bringing diverse candidates in through the apprenticeship route. I think a lot of companies still focus quite a bit on graduates, and that's understandable, but I've seen some other organisations do very well by looking at post-92 universities, for instance, because when you look at the post-92s, the ex-polys, what you end up with there is you've got students who are far more likely to live within commuting distance, so by bus or train of their university. They're not likely to be in halls of residence or renting. So they're going to come from a much broader socioeconomic background. And that's likely to bring you in candidates who actually bring a better value add, rather than just going to kids who've gone through grammar school or fee-paying private schools and ended up in Oxbridge and are getting there through privilege. So I think there's a lot you can do around that. I think the other thing for me that works particularly well, again, it links back to what Elizabeth was saying, around the whole process of onboarding is that message that you're putting out there about your organization. What is your employee value proposition? What are your values as a company? We're a mutual. We focus a lot on that when we're talking to people. And for us, it's very much about explaining where you fit into the organization, what our values are. Inclusion is at the core of who we are as a business. And I'd like to think that, that the work we've done over the recent years has started to really make a difference in that place. I think we're just working on a program at the moment called Your Path, which helps people to understand how your career has the potential to develop and progress through the organization. I think it's pulling all of those things together, for me, are things that will work. One other thing we have done, which I think is an interesting experiment, and I think it will pay off in the longer term, is we're starting to look very closely at qualifications and saying, actually, are we really asking for the right things? Shouldn't we really be saying, as long as you've got, you've got good levels of numeracy, good levels of literacy, we can probably teach you most of the things you need to know and develop you internally in the organization, rather than expect you to come in with a whole load of gold-plated qualifications, which may not necessarily be relevant.
Thank you, Simon. So again, that personal aspect of the process as well, and again, in some way reflecting back to the job spec when you mentioned about the qualifications or not qualifications, it doesn't matter. It's about the person. It's about their potential and their strengths, rather than you must tick these boxes. Great, thank you very much, Simon. So I was right. We have 11 minutes to go, and I just put the light back on. We have 11 minutes to go, and 3 questions, I think, so far that have come in. So thank you very much for raising questions. If we can fit all 3 into 10 minutes, then great. Ginny, may I start with the question focused to you? So what's the best way to, question, Rooney Rule, what's the best way to implement this in practice? For example, if as part of our D&I strategy, we'd like to use it to increase the number of Black women in roles in the organisation, how do we approach this if candidates prefer not to disclose this information?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I think I've got a pretty strong opinion about the need for candidates to disclose this. I think there's plenty of reasons why candidates probably should be uncomfortable disclosing this, because there's a lot of research that shows that even if your name isn't British and you don't have a picture on your resume, and maybe you don't have your picture on your LinkedIn profile, sorry, I had to obviously bring the profiles in. There is research that shows that you are less likely to get invited even to the first stage of an interview. So like Hannah, I would say, I think the Rooney Rule is potentially more focused on when you get to that first stage or past that first stage. I think it's much more important to focus on where are you getting the candidates from? How are you communicating to people? So for example, Simon was just mentioning as well, there are some specific job boards out there where you can tap into a specific talent pool. Obviously make sure that your job spec is very clear about the fact that you welcome everybody in your organization. And then, quite frankly, you have to do a little bit of the work. You might have to sift through quite a few resumes and get to the people that you then want to put forward for that stage 1 or stage 2 interview. But make sure that as you get to that stage, there is a balanced slate of candidates that you're putting forward to the hiring manager or whomever is doing that work. I think, you know, that's where we all have to invest our time to make sure that we don't just sift out the, you know, Oxbridge resumes and put them forward, or that we rely too much on referrals. Like, we have to do the work, get people from different places, and then making sure that they make it through that first and second stage interview. I'm sure that Steph and Elizabeth and Simon have you know, loads of ideas on this as well. I just want to make sure I haven't missed anything really glaringly obvious.
Please do interject if there's any additional info on that. If not,
I think on the on that thing about the questions, I think it's critical to ask up front, because that's the only way you can possibly track who's applying, who's coming into your business. But I totally understand the reluctance for some people to share that information, and I think the best thing you can do in that position is actually demonstrate your commitment to them. Explain the reason why we're asking you this is because we know as a business we have an issue with a lack of people from diverse backgrounds. We want to do better at that. That's why we're doing this. But be reassured that the information that you're giving to us as the sort of first stage of hiring will not necessarily go through to the hiring manager. You know, they can still go through a blind recruitment process, but it allows us to monitor who's coming in and then connect that data at the other end with the hires to be able to then track people through the business. Data, I mean, this is the world of technology here we're talking about. Data is critical, and we need to know who it is we're employing and then be able to track them all the way through their career in order to make sure that we are not either deliberately or inadvertently leaving people behind.
So again, going back to the first part of the attraction process, it's the language that's being used. You do see in a lot of cases it's a you must do this and you must do that as part of the application process, but limited reasoning as to why and actually how it benefits them as individuals and organisations in their entirety. Thank you. I've got another question. This is about onboarding. So, Elizabeth, may I come back to you as another question? How can we ensure that inclusive behaviours within the onboarding process continue as we onboard virtually? It's a very current topic. Tough one.
It is I think it's a good question. I always say it's important to go back to that 3 category breakdown, which is the operational, the social, and the strategic, and making sure that you're still covering all of those points, even if it's virtual. So things that you can think of, the team introduction, so how you introduce them to the team, introducing them to the department, asking about well-being, especially during this period. You don't know what people may have gone through over the last couple of months. So making a conscious effort to actually ask on one-on-one, how have you been over this period? And going back to that question, asking what can we do to support you to execute your job or do your job really well? Having periodic check-ins with them. I know in our organization, we have Monday morning meetings, and then we also have Friday reflections. So typically in the office, we would sit around and have small bites, but in the absence of that, we still have that. We still make sure the things that we would do in the office, we still find a way to make sure it's still ongoing. Another thing that we've done is over this period, we've had a diversity and inclusion refresher. Again, for any new person coming in to know that this is what diversity and inclusion means to us. Also, one of the things that we've noted in some organizations, there's been they haven't acknowledged the social justice issues that's been going on over the last few months. But the ones that have done really well are those managers where they've had new hires who are Black and have called or emailed and say, how are you doing over this period? Again, that question, is there anything I can do for you during this period? So it goes back to, have I covered the operation, the social, and the strategic? And what have I done as the manager to be more conscious and making a real effort to reach out?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you. We can squeeze one more question in, I think, before our hour's up, and it's another tricky one. Steph, may I come to you? This is I suppose a big question, but the question is how can you ensure women and BAME employees are being promoted? Would KPIs for leaders help?
Oh, that is a tough one.
Yeah, sorry.
What I will say is, in regards to KPIs, it's a blessing and a curse. And a blessing in a way that as a woman from a minority background, you are able to document where you've done well and be able to kind of put forward a case as to why you should be promoted. Unfortunately, biases exist. And there are so many cases where a woman from a minority background might not have a great relationship with her manager. And despite how well she does within the organization, she's still not going to be promoted because there tends to be this kind of I guess, sign off on, like, have you actually done the work that you said you've done? And if you're working with someone who doesn't champion you, then you are going to struggle within that organization. One point I will say is going back to Simon's point actually on employees network. In my last role, I actually was a chair of the BAME network, and it was really good because you get to see people who look like you, but you could also learn from other people how they've been able to navigate issues that you're struggling with, that you may not be comfortable to speak with other people in your team. Now, finally, when it comes to actually employee engagement and data, unfortunately, if you're the only Black person in your team, you wouldn't want to put your ethnicity down because it's a little bit obvious as to who said what. So people will not feel comfortable. So what I will say is KPIs are good for women, you know, for BAME women to demonstrate what they've done. But I also think this 360, them able to actually have other engagement from people externally from their team who they have a good relationship with, as a way of them gathering evidence about the work they've done, is also a very good point. So if you are going to follow KPIs, I would say make it holistic and not one that is directly linked to the manager, but one that's linked to potential other members in their team or people outside their team, because then they're able to put a stronger case forward. So that'll probably be my advice for that question.
Thank you, Steph. So that's all we've got time for, actually. I think with 1 minute to spare, which I'm probably sure won't have a question answered in it. So if you do have any questions that are unanswered, as I said at the beginning, please do reach out to techUK or myself, and we're happy to fill questions out to the panel and back. As I said, we could talk about this for days probably. The key aspect of this webinar, hopefully to those involved, were to take 3 actions away, to declutter the complexity of this subject, and to dispel some of the myths as well that are associated with it. Ultimately, I think what I've taken from this is that it's personal, and it needs to remain personal and bespoke. We need to be open-minded as to the skills and capabilities of people rather than match CVs against job specs. We break it down micro process. So bit by bit by bit, it doesn't need to be an entire, this is our target and this is how we're going to achieve it. It's more about how we're going to achieve it at each stage. And then that will then complete the strategy for you. So thank you very much to Steph, Elizabeth, Janine and Simon. I'm super grateful for your time. I hope it's been useful to those that have been watching today, and have a wonderful rest of Monday and London Tech Week. Thank you very much.